All right. Please take your seat. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the poster market. It looked crowded, like a pub, basically. So you guys must be addicted to something because we were not serving alcohol. Maybe science could be. I welcome our guests. They are here on the front row. The Masters of Ceremony will introduce them. Nikolaos, Mark, and Bart, thank you for coming to our event today. We have a full house, especially for you, because we're going to have a dialogue. Our Masters of Ceremony are Guido van Wingen and Christiaan Vinkers. But let's first look, because Guido is going to introduce the team, especially Individuality in Psychiatry. But let's first ask you what you think of the team. So what is the first word that comes to mind when you read about the team? So what comes to mind when you think about the science of individuality? And while you guys are typing, yeah, there's 5 people typing, so the numbers need to go up now. I can maybe introduce the way in which the team did arise. So usually every year, so this is the 7th time that we do this event. I think around 2019 or so, Diederik and I, Diederik is also in the room now, right? There you are. Diederik. So that is Diederik van den Berg, my co-director, who missed I dearly this morning and several months. Diederik and I actually introduced this idea that we want to have a team every year. And then we discussed it in the management team. And the management team, that is, several people are here from the management team. They can actually give consent to the fact that we were actually discussing it. And the theme of individuality came about. And people were very enthusiastic about it, both from different points of view. Guido will explain that. Okay, so let me introduce the Masters of Ceremony, and then they can take it away. Guido van Wingen is a cognitive neuroscientist, so he is also linking 2 fields, like several others this morning. He is a professor in neuroimaging of psychiatry. He is a board member of the management team of Amsterdam Neuroscience, and together with psychiatrist Christiaan Vinkers, he is one of the 2 out of 20 new appointments after the last 6 years, being a full professor. Your professorship is on stress and resilience, so that all the ingredients are there now to take this team to the next level. So please, Guido, come to the stage. Your floor is yours.
Thank you, Arjan, and great to see you all with so many after couple of years of COVID when we did all this online. I'm so happy to be here and to talk with you and especially our speakers about the future of psychiatry. And all of you already, it's off the screen, unfortunately. In the middle of everything was personalization, precision. So that's where we have to move forward to, which is also the theme of today. And that's why we have invited speakers that are forwarding the field in psychiatry and moving towards individual tailoring of prognosis and of treatment itself. And we will introduce, first we'll start off with a patient perspective. We'll have Bart Groeneweg, who, thank you for being here. He is the director of the Depression Association, and he will talk about having depression, experience it, what is it actually like, how can patient organizations participate in science, and how do patients look at precision and where you have to move forward to. Then Nikolaos Koutsouleris from Munich will be here. I will introduce him later. He will talk about contribution of imaging and AI to moving towards prognosis. Mark is here. He will present about tailoring treatment using AI, and we'll then have a short wrap-up where we discuss the open issues. So, without further ado, I'll introduce my co-host, Christiaan Vinkers, who will, together with Bart Groeneweg, will first discuss. We will continue in Dutch, and thereafter come back in English.
Good afternoon, Bart. It's good to see you. we're going to do this in Dutch, so we already discussed this. We're going to talk about depression, about precision psychiatry. We have a few movies. We're going to do this in Dutch. Gewoon lekker Nederlands. Ja, toch? Ja, heel goed. Nee, en dus voor de mensen die geen Nederlands spreken, die versta je het ook niet. Wat we gaan doen, de vragen staan open. We hebben een half uur. Bart en ik kennen we elkaar, dus we zeggen gewoon je tegen elkaar. En als ik vragen stel die hij niet wil beantwoorden, dan zeg ik, dan gaat je niks aan, zegt hij dan tegen mij.
Ja.
Dus dat is heel goed.
Ja, oké.
En de Slido is open. Dus dat betekent, we gaan over heel veel dingen hebben. Zijn er vragen? Stel ze gewoon op Slido. En dan zien wij ze hier. En dan kan ik er af en toe nog eentje uitpakken om mee te beginnen. En Bart, we hadden bedacht om eerst... Er is een filmpje van de depressievereniging... om die eerst even te laten zien, om even erin te komen. Het is het Nederlands met Engelse ondertitels. En dan komen we terug. Dus dan graag het eerste filmpje.
Ik was diep ongelukkig. Ik vond het moeilijk bijvoorbeeld om 's morgens op te staan. Ik had geen energie, de hele dag moe. En ik kan me herinneren, dan sleepte ik me naar mijn werk elke ochtend. Want ik bleef gewoon wel werken. Ik heb me nooit ziek gemeld. Maar dan zat ik in de trein te huilen van onvermogen, onmacht, moeheid. Bijna niet voor elkaar krijgen. En toch iedere keer maar weer doorgaan. Want werk en studeren vaak ook hielp me wel om contact met het leven te houden en een doel te hebben.
Het heeft te maken met energie die onderdrukt wordt. Ja, in het Engels depressed. Je levensenergie die niet goed kan stromen. En niet goed contact hebben met mijn gevoel. Ja, ook vastzitten. Dus leven is bewegen en depressie is stilstaan.
Een depressie voelt voor mij als een uitzichtloze put waar je in zit en waar je op zijn diepste punt ook niet meer uitkomt.
Depressie betekent voor mij een hele grote angst. Angstig voor zware emoties, de wereld, het leven. Maar voor mij is het ook een verslaving. Iets waar ik tegen beter weten in soms wel mijn heil in zoek. Iets wat ik soms expres vasthoud. Het verklaart een hoop. Dus dat angst en verslaving.
En de ene depressie is ook de andere niet.
Ja, Bart, dit ging over mensen met een depressie en grote verschillen tussen mensen met depressie. Hoe kijk jij ernaar en kan je iets vertellen over hoe je hier gekomen bent, dat je hier vandaag bij ons zit?
Dat ik hier vandaag zit is omdat jij me gevraagd hebt. Ik ben hier gekomen via de depressievereniging. Jullie hebben een aantal verhalen gezien van leden van de depressievereniging die ook actief zijn in de depressievereniging. Met name als het gaat om de lotgenotengroepen. Wij noemen dat overigens supportgroepen. En men kan daar ondersteuning aan elkaar geven. En ik ben hier terechtgekomen om iets te vertellen over mijn depressies. En dat is natuurlijk ook naast de verhalen die je hier hebt gezien, is dat natuurlijk gewoon een toch wel uniek verhaal ook. Hè. Er zijn altijd overeenkomsten met anderen. Maar ik heb mijn geschiedenis en mijn verhaal. En ik kan ook daarom vooral vanuit mijn verhaal dingen zeggen, aangeven. Want het is heel verschillend. Ik zag net bijvoorbeeld het woordje angst. Bij mij is angst iets wat een enorme rol altijd heeft gespeeld. Zeker als ik depressief was. En wat mij ook nog opviel in het filmpje, en daar gaan we gelijk op in, de verslaafd zijn aan je depressie. Daar heb ik echt wel over na zitten denken. Hoe kan je in vredesnaam ergens aan verslaafd raken en waar je, naar mijn mening, maar beperkte invloed op hebt als het gaat over herstellen. Tuurlijk, je kan wel invloed hebben. Maar ik heb gedacht, misschien vindt zij het heel prettig om de regie een tijdje kwijt te zijn. En je bent, als je depressief bent, toch weer steeds op zoek, althans ik, naar die regie. Hè, naar houvast om je eigen leven weer te kunnen leiden zoals je wil dat het gaat. En ja, ik heb er alleen maar alles aan gedaan om daar weer uit te komen. En het woordje verslaving, dat komt echt niet in mijn denkraam voor. Ik wil er gewoon echt van af als ik erin zit.
Ja. Hoeveel depressies heb je gehad?
Dat weet ik eigenlijk niet. Maar pas rond mijn 50ste is diagnose gesteld. Toen had ik ontslag genomen in de jeugdzorg. Ik was daar bestuurder. En na dat ontslag, want ik dacht met dat ontslag kom ik misschien uit het cynisme, uit de slapeloosheid. Er was heel veel met me aan de hand. En toen via crisisdiensten waar ik terecht ben gekomen, is uiteindelijk de diagnose depressie gesteld. Als ik in mijn leven terug ga kijken, heb ik ook periodes gehad, toch wel van een matige, soms ook ernstige depressie. Alleen het werd zo niet genoemd. En ik stak ook echt heel duidelijk mijn kop in het zand. Mijn moeder heeft last van depressie, ik denk haar hele leven. Mijn jongere broer heeft ook last van depressie, die is op zijn 19e voor de eerste keer opgenomen. Dus het was wel iets wat in ons gezin, in onze familie speelt. Ja. Alleen ik wilde dat voor mezelf niet weten. Ik had best wel stress en hyperventilatie en angsten en slaapproblemen. Maar het woord depressie was heel erg ver op de achtergrond bij mij.
En toen op je 50ste die diagnose kreeg, was dat dan een opluchting of juist iets wat je niet wilde?
Het was toch ook wel een schok. En tegelijkertijd dat het een naam had, vond ik ook wel prettig. Hè? Want als er wordt gezegd depressie en we gaan behandelen, je krijgt voor de eerste keer ook medicatie. Dat vond ik op zich wel heel fijn, omdat ik natuurlijk ook van al die ellende, dat was het toch echt, af wilde.
Ja. Ja. En je hebt ook een filmpje meegenomen, misschien is het goed om dat nu even te kijken, de Black Dog. Ja, hè?
Black Dog.
Maar dan kunnen we het daarna hebben over hoe heterogene eigenlijk depressie is en hoe jij daarnaar kijkt. Maar zullen we eerst het filmpje even kijken?
Ja, ja ik heb dat gevraagd. Ik vind het filmpje heel mooi aangegeven. En ook echt vanuit het perspectief van de patiënt, van de zieke, van de mens met de depressie. En het is zo mooi beeldend, ik herken er ook zoveel in. Dus dan is het ook makkelijk om dan te zeggen, nou ja, wat jullie daar zien, dat heb ik echt een heel aantal keren doorgemaakt. Ja.
En de Black Dog, dat komt van Churchill, toch?
Ja, ja.
Die noemde zijn depressies de Black
Klopt.
Dog.
Ja.
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 I had a black dog. His name was depression. Whenever the black dog made an appearance, I felt empty and life just seemed to slow down. He could surprise me with a visit for no reason or occasion. The black dog made me look and feel older than my years. When the rest of the world seemed to be enjoying life, I could only see it through the black dog. Activities that usually brought me pleasure suddenly ceased to. He liked to ruin my appetite. He chewed up my memory and my ability to concentrate. Doing anything or going anywhere with the black dog required superhuman strength. At social occasions, he'd sniff out what confidence I had and chase it away. My biggest fear was being found out. I worried that people would judge me. Because of the shame and stigma of the black dog, I was constantly worried that I'd be found out. So I invested vast amounts of energy into covering him up. Keeping up an emotional lie is exhausting. Black dog could make me think and say negative things. He could make me irritable and difficult to be around. He would take my love and bury my intimacy. He loved nothing more than to wake me up with highly repetitive and negative thinking. He also liked to remind me how exhausted I was going to be the next day. Having a black dog in your life isn't so much about feeling a bit down, sad or blue. At its worst, it's about being devoid of feeling altogether. As I got older, the black dog got bigger and he started hanging around all the time. I'd chase him off with whatever I thought might send him running. But more often than not, he'd come out on top. Going down became easier than getting up again. So I became rather good at self-medication, which never really helped. Eventually, I felt totally isolated from everything and everyone. The black dog had finally succeeded in hijacking my life. When you lose all joy in life, you can begin to question what the point of it is. Thankfully, this was the time that I sought professional help. This was my first step towards recovery and a major turning point in my life. I learned that it doesn't matter who you are, the black dog affects millions and millions of people. It is an equal opportunity mongrel. I also learned that there was no silver bullet or magic pill. Medication can help some, and others might need a different approach altogether. I also learned that being emotionally genuine and authentic to those who are close to you can be an absolute game changer. Most importantly, I learnt not to be afraid of the black dog, and I taught him a few new tricks of my own. The more tired and stressed you are, the louder he barks. So it's important to learn how to quiet your mind. It's been clinically proven that regular exercise can be as effective for treating mild to moderate depression as antidepressants. So go for a walk or a run and leave the mutt behind. Keep a mood journal. Getting your thoughts on paper can be cathartic and often insightful. Also keep track of the things that you have to be grateful for. The most important thing to remember is that no matter how bad it gets, if you take the right steps, talk to the right people, black dog days can and will pass. I wouldn't say that I'm grateful for the black dog, but he's been an incredible teacher. He forced me to re-evaluate and simplify my life. I learnt that rather than running away from my problems, it's better to embrace them. The black dog may always be part of my life, but he'll never be the beast that he was. We have an understanding. I've learned through knowledge, patience, discipline and humour, the worst black dog can be made to heal. If you're in difficulty, never be afraid to ask for help. There is absolutely no shame in doing so. The only shame is missing out on life.
Ja, een heel mooi filmpje.
Absoluut, ja.
En wat is voor jou herkenbaar als dit zo...
Ja, de fases waar deze man in heeft gezeten. En wat, ik zal maar zeggen, dat samenvallen van die hond en die man op enig moment. Hè, je bent dan, als je op je diepste punt zit, ben je ook je depressie. Dat denk je ook. Ik vind dat heel mooi, een hele mooie metafoor die daar wordt gemaakt. En wat ik ook wel heel fijn aan het filmpje vind, is dat het toch ook perspectief biedt. En ik denk dat ook voor mensen met een depressie is ook perspectief. Althans voor een heel groot gedeelte van de mensen die lijden aan depressie. Dat zal zo'n 70-80% zijn die uiteindelijk wel weer op enig moment herstellen. Maar goed, er is ook een gedeelte die niet zo gelukkig is als deze man. En die toch jaren en jaren maar door blijven worstelen. En zeker op het moment dat het een ernstige depressie is, dan lijkt mij dat bijna ondoenlijk.
Ja. En in het filmpje wordt ook gesproken over stigma en schaamte en zo. Hè? Dat wordt, denk jij dat hoeveel stigma en schaamte is er nog rondom depressie? Ik
denk veel. Wij, ook in de depressievereniging, mensen worden daar actief in een werkgroep of worden begeleider van een supportgroep. En er zijn echt een heel aantal mensen die zeggen, mijn naam moet niet op de website komen, mijn naam moet niet naar buiten komen, want mijn werk. En dat is dus ingewikkeld. Kijk, ik ben er zelf altijd vrij open over geweest. Ik vind ook geen punt om er hierover te praten. Maar dat heeft mij ook wel, denk ik, bijvoorbeeld in mijn loopbaan erg dwars gezeten en genekt eigenlijk op het laatst. Dat je dan toch iemand bent waar een hele grote vlek op zit, waar headhunters een risico mee lopen als ze mij weer gaan bemiddelen. En één heeft het letterlijk tegen me gezegd, Bart, je bent een risicofactor, ik ga je niet meer bemiddelen. Ja, toen was ik 59. Zo sta je op je 59ste eigenlijk op een arbeidsmarkt die niet meer op jou zit te wachten. Ja. Na 100 sollicitaties. En dat heb ik heel erg moeilijk gevonden ook. Ja. Omdat natuurlijk werk en inkomen en zekerheid voor jezelf en voor je kinderen, ja, dat is ontzettend belangrijk. En als je depressief bent, dan ben je daar al zo onzeker over.
Dus dan komt het extra hard aan.
Dan komt het extra hard aan en dan krijg je extra schuldgevoelens. Ik zei net even tussendoor, ik heb toen ontslag genomen, ook uit wanhoop. Ik vond ook echt dat het niet meer verantwoord was dat ik dat werk ging doen. Maar goed, ook met zo'n stap krijg je weer meer schuldgevoelens naar je kinderen en naar mijn partner. Ja. En naar Inge.
En je praat daar nu heel open over. En dat is natuurlijk heel... Depressie, iedereen heeft ook wel eens somberheidsgevoelens die bij het leven horen. En dan heb je ook nog depressie als aparte ziekte. Zijn dat voor jou twee aparte dingen die heel goed te onderscheiden zijn? Van dit is Bart die somber is, maar dat hoort er gewoon bij en dit is mijn depressie?
Nou, ik denk dat als ik depressief ben, dan merken mensen dat wel aan me. Kijk, ik ben over het algemeen sta ik niet negatief in het leven of ik ben ook geen somberaar, helemaal niet. Maar op het moment dat ik ziek ben, dan kan je het ook echt aan mij zien. Misschien word ik wel iets kleiner in de beelden van anderen. Maar je ziet in ieder geval in mijn ogen, die combinatie met angst, die is er altijd. En dat wordt ook tegen me gezegd. Dat ziet de huisarts, dat zien ze thuis uiteraard met kinderen. En Ja, het is wel een andere Bart dan zoals ik nu hier ben. Dat, absoluut. Het is zo alles overheersend. Ik vond ook een mooi voorbeeld dat die depressieve man op een gegeven moment op een receptie was en dan al die mensen om me heen. Ja, ik heb ook recepties meegemaakt of de diploma-uitreiking van mijn dochter. Ik heb grotendeels op de wc doorgebracht. Gewoon vluchten, dat kon ik gewoon niet aan. Je vond dat je er naartoe moest, en zeker als het over het diploma van je dochter gaat. Maar het ging eigenlijk totaal niet. Ja. En dat zien mensen dan wel aan me, ja.
Maar het is minder zichtbaar voor als je Parkinson hebt, dan,
absoluut.
Dan zie je dat.
Ja. Nee, daarom zeg ik ook alleen de mensen die me kennen, die zien het.
Ja.
Die me goed kennen. Maar ja, voor de buitenwacht is het iets heel onbekends. En denken ze, depressie.
Waarom zit die man op de wc?
Ja, waarom zit die man op de wc? Ja. Of die zegt, ik heb ook wel eens een burn-out gehad dan tegen me. Ja, lastig. Ja, terwijl het toch in mijn beleving iets heel anders is dan dat.
Ja. Dus voor jou is het in die zin echt ook afgescheiden van dit is mijn depressie, een langere periode waarin ik echt niks meer kan en een andere persoon was dan ik normaal gesproken ben.
Ja, klopt. En wat ik ook wel heb gemerkt, ik denk dat de eerste keer ook bij mij rond mijn 20 is geweest. Het is wel steeds ernstiger geworden en ook langer heeft het herstel geduurd. Ik ben nu 6 jaar geleden ook weer gestopt, heb ik ook weer ontslag moeten nemen. En ik heb er echt 3,5 jaar over gedaan voordat ik weer dacht van de oude Bart is er weer een beetje. Dat heeft echt veel te lang geduurd, ook opgenomen geweest. We hadden gewoon niet de goede slag te pakken, zou ik maar zeggen. En ik zeker niet.
En nou is depressie ook wel een hele heterogene aandoening. Hè? Dus een van de symptomen gaat het over, je kan veel of weinig slapen, veel eten of weinig eten. Je kan honderden combinaties van symptomen maken. Hoe zie jij de verschillen van mensen met een depressie?
Nou ja, een aantal van die symptomen komen wel terug. Hè. De laatste keer toen was ik ook weer echt ernstig depressief. Ik viel in 3 weken 8 kilo af, terwijl eten ging ook niet zo makkelijk. Maar je zag het dus ook echt aan mijn lichaam gebeuren. Die slaapstoornissen zijn voor mij echt iets heel groots. Ik kan er ook ontzettend slecht tegen om nachten thuis alleen in de kamer door te brengen maar niet kunnen slapen. En steeds bang zijn dat je de volgende dag uitgeput bent. Dat waren echt vicieuze cirkels waar ik in zat. Piekeren heb ik veel gedaan. Ik denk dat bij mij ook, en dat zal misschien bij anderen ook zo gelden, het perspectiefloze. Ik vroeg heel vaak bevestiging, ook de laatste keer. Ik word toch wel beter. Ik kon het echt 100 keer op een dag ook aan mijn vrouw vragen. Ja, en als het komt goed, dan geloofde je dat niet. Want je had geen perspectief. Hè? Dus het is zo dwingend in de richting van een hele smalle tunnel. En waar je op het eind ook niet het licht ziet. Het is echt een zwarte tunnel waar je middenin zit.
Dus dan wat je ook dan vaak ziet, dat de gedachten aan de dood komen.
Ja, de suïcidegedachten. Ik ben daar ook, heb ik heel veel ook last van gehad. Ik ben ook echt bezig geweest met voorbereiden van de suïcide. Spullen ervoor gekocht. Op een gegeven moment is het toch een keer, toen ik in crisis weer bij de huisarts was en zij vroeg dat was de laatste keer ook aan mij van, joh Bart, denk je wel eens aan suïcide? Toen heb ik gezegd dat het geval was. Nou, Inge, mijn vrouw, dat zijn dingen een van de weinige dingen waar ik dan niet over praat. Die schrok zich natuurlijk ook een ongeluk. Want ik wilde ook echt dood. Nou, gelukkig, die huisarts waar ik veel vertrouwen in had en nog steeds heb, moet ik zeggen, die vroeg het en toen ben ik uiteindelijk via een crisisteam is het weer goed gekomen, in de zin van goed. Ik heb ook afgesproken dat ik het gewoon niet zou doen. Je bent daar dan zo alleen mee bezig, dat je het perspectiefloze omzet in gewoon stoppen met leven. En dan denk je ook niet over mijn kinderen, ik denk dan ook niet over een partner, ik denk niet over broers en zussen en goede vrienden. Ja. Dat is weg.
Het moet gewoon stoppen.
Het moet gewoon stoppen, want het drijft je tot enorme wanhoop.
En tegelijkertijd, zoals je nu hier ziet, is het natuurlijk heel moeilijk voor te stellen hoe dat voor jou was misschien ook, maar ook voor de mensen hier. Nu zit je hier maar weer gewoon en het lijkt vanaf de buitenkant redelijk goed met je te gaan.
Ja, van de binnenkant ook wel hoor. Ik heb nog een hoge dosis medicijnen en als het nodig is, dan kan ik ook bij de huisarts, bij een psychiater, bij een behandelaar terecht. Dat is vorig jaar zomer nog een keer gebeurd. Ik heb dat zo mooi heet, een terugvalpreventieplan. En dan mogen mijn zoon, Inge, de huisarts en een hele goede vriend, die mogen tegen mij zeggen, Bart, en nou stap je eruit. Het was weer een situatie, en dat was allemaal in de privésfeer, met heel veel stress en heel veel mantelzorg en toestanden. Ja, zij zagen dat het gewoon niet goed met me ging. En ik luisterde op dat moment gewoon naar hen van, oké, dan stop ik er ook echt mee. Ik ben eruit gestapt. Ja. Want anders was het helemaal misgegaan. Ik zat weer niet in de downsize, maar meer in het hypomane. Dan word ik gewoon heel druk en irritant. En ja dat is wat wantrouwend. En dat is dan ben ik gewoon mezelf niet meer.
En ook heel veel mensen in de zaal doen onderzoek naar stress en trauma en zo. En je noemt nu stress. Is dat dan een belangrijke factor voor jou geweest die ontregelend werkt?
Ja, ik denk dat een vroeg trauma heeft bij mij ook wel een rol gespeeld. Maar dat is niet volgens mij de oorzaak van depressie. Maar meer onveilige hechting en dat soort zaken. Maar stress heeft bij mij wel de keren dat het ook echt ernstig was een grote rol gespeeld. Ik heb het wel eens verteld ergens anders toen ik ben ook gepromoveerd. En een jaar voordat ik promotie zou zijn, is het gebouw waar ik in zat totaal afgebrand. Dat was bij Humanitas in Rotterdam. Ik las het in de krant overigens. En er zaten al mijn onderzoeksgegevens op een aantal data in het accu in het rekencentrum in Utrecht na. Maar dat heeft zoveel stress gegeven. Ik was natuurlijk 5 jaar mee bezig. Alles, kaartjes. Nou, je kent het allemaal wel. Kinderen testen en observeren. En ja,
het verliezen van onderzoeksgegevens is stressvol voor alle mensen hier. Hè? Even terzijde ook.
Ja, ik was dus alles kwijt in de tijd. Dus dat het nog per fax ging. Per post kreeg ik artikelen uit New York en Philadelphia. Het ging allemaal over verslaafde ouders en hun kinderen. En kinderen die verslaafd geboren waren. Daar heb ik een studie naar gedaan. Maar dat is dan ook zo mega veel stress en dan gaat het ook met me mis. En ik heb het ook wel eerder gezegd, ik heb rond mijn 48ste was ik toen met het gezin in een tsunami terechtgekomen, wat ook gigatrauma is geweest. We hebben het overleefd, maar het was wel een trauma. En nou ja, als laatste wat toen ook speelde was dat ik een jaar lang ook door een cliënt thuis ook ben bedreigd. Mijn kinderen werden ook bedreigd, politiebescherming en alles. Ja, en als je dan al wankel bent... ik denk dat heel veel mensen zouden omvallen. Alleen, ik word dan erg depressief. Ja. En dat is dan het verschil, denk ik. Die kwetsbaarheid die zit er. Dat zie ik natuurlijk ook aan mijn moeder en aan mijn broer. Dat zit in de familie. Ja. Maar als dan zo extern zoveel stress binnenkomt, wat ik niet goed kan verwerken... dat kon ik al sowieso niet zo heel erg goed. Dan gaat het dus gewoon verkeerd. Ja.
En heel veel mensen zullen te maken in de zaal zelf met depressie te maken hebben gehad. Of mensen in de omgeving. Ja. En een van de vragen die ik zo tussen mijn oogharen heen lees is van hoe moet je daarmee omgaan? Je vertelt er nu heel open over, maar dat is eigenlijk ook niet echt gemeengoed. Wat moeten mensen?
Nou, vooral er niet omheen lopen. En gewoon vragen hoe het gaat. En wat er goed gaat en wat er niet goed gaat. En als ze niet willen praten, dan niet. Maar blijf er bijvoorbeeld gewoon bij. Ik heb ook periodes gehad dat gewoon afspraken waren met een vriendengroep om bij mij te blijven, omdat ik dan heel erg suïcidaal was. Ja, en ik niet de hele dag alleen thuis kon blijven. Dus dan werd dat georganiseerd. Ja. En die vrienden en vriendinnen, die waren er gewoon. En dat was al in zo'n periode ontzettend belangrijk. Ja.
Ja. En hoe kunnen mensen dan een depressie herkennen? Want bij jou heeft het ook al tot je 50ste geduurd voor je de diagnose kreeg. Misschien heeft het ook te maken met ook het stigma en zo. Maar
nou ja, je kunt het... Kijk, op het moment dat mensen natuurlijk cynisch en somber worden en het niet zien zitten of heel moe zijn. Ik vind zelf, zal maar zeggen, het niet slapen. De slaapstoornissen, de slaapproblemen. Ja, als je het gewoon aan een vriendin of aan een vriend vraagt, van hoe gaat het nou met je slapen? En je hoort dat al maanden niet goed gaat met het inslapen. Dan weet je dat er gewoon iets aan de hand kan zijn. Ik vind ook eigenlijk dat in de psychiatrie en zeker bij depressie, dat bioritme, dat daar eerst naar moet worden gekeken. Ik heb een tijd voor neurocare gewerkt, waar ze de transcraniële magnetische stimulatie doen bij depressie. Daar wordt eerst naar het slaappatroon, naar het bioritme gevraagd. Mensen krijgen een slaaphorloge mee naar huis. Ja, ik vind het geweldig dat ze dat doen. En waarom dat niet bij andere GGZ-instellingen gebeurt, ik zou het niet weten.
Ja. Want je noemt in de gauwigheid stress, slaap, je noemt RTMS. Hoe belangrijk is het om wetenschappelijk onderzoek te doen naar depressie? Is dat voldoende? Hoeveel lacunes liggen er nog? Hoe kijk je?
Het is nooit voldoende. En ik vind het... laat ik zeggen, ik ben pas sinds 6 jaar ook gaan interesseren voor depressie en ook voor het wetenschappelijk onderzoek. Er is natuurlijk heel veel niet onderzocht. En er staat natuurlijk ook gewoon heel veel stil op dit moment. Als je kijkt naar de biologisch-medische oorzaak van depressie, ja, daar wordt op dit moment niet zo heel veel onderzoek nog steeds niet naar gedaan. En
hoe komt dat?
Ik ben geen wetenschapper. Blijkbaar hebben te veel mensen al een blauwtje gelopen of geen resultaten gevonden in hun onderzoek. Maar misschien is het ook gewoon te complex. Ja. Maar waarom wetenschappers dat niet doen, dat weet ik niet. Ik vind het is heel duidelijk dat er zijn biologische factoren, er zijn psychologische factoren, de omgeving, de sociale factoren. En in die combinatie ontstaat dan blijkbaar die depressie, inclusief de stress vanuit de omgeving. Maar ja, neem die kant van dat biologische ook heel serieus. En ga daarmee door met onderzoek. En zeker als het gaat over neurowetenschappen, ja, daar ben ik enorm voorstander van. Ja. Voor mij zijn toen ik ben ook niet voor niks met die RTMS aan de slag gegaan. Ik vond het zo mooi dat er toch een echt goed effect is, ook bij therapie-resistente depressie. En het geen enkele bijwerking heeft. Dan denk ik, ja, waarom doen we dat niet met z'n allen? Ja. Want die medicijnen slikken, ja, dat heeft natuurlijk ook altijd een heel aantal nadelen. Dat vind ik ook echt.
Ja. Dus de boodschap is eigenlijk voor de neurowetenschappers hier...
Ga door.
Ja, of begin ermee. Stop wat je doet, ga naar depressie. Is dat een beetje de... Nee, ik
snap wat je bedoelt. Nou ja, er kan gewoon heel veel meer onderzoek plaatsvinden. En ja, ik weet niet hoe jij er tegenaan kijkt, maar goed, ik stel geen vraag aan jou, maar de stand van de wetenschap als het gaat over psychiatrie, ja, daar valt natuurlijk nog heel veel te verbeteren.
Nou ja, ik ben benieuwd wat je daarvan vindt, dat er vaak een scholenstrijd lijkt in de psychiatrie, want het is of de omgeving, of de psychologie, of de biologie.
En het is natuurlijk alle drie.
Ja.
Want we hangen met elkaar toch dat biopsychosociale model aan. De depressievereniging zegt ook, wij willen als het gaat over wetenschappelijk onderzoek vanuit dat denkmodel werken en onze bijdrage leveren. En wat voor ons dan natuurlijk altijd het allerbelangrijkste is, als er onderzoek wordt gedaan, dan kijken we natuurlijk ook naar de vooral toepasbaarheid in de praktijk. En nou, dat is natuurlijk bij een heel aantal onderzoeken gaat dat ontzettend traag. Ik heb dan wel die RTMS nu meegemaakt. Nou, esketamine de neusspray is nu op de markt. Dat heeft denk ik ook wel met neuropsychologie te maken, in ieder geval met het brein. Ja, en verder gebeurt natuurlijk in de praktijk niet zo heel veel. Ja.
En nu kan je met die artificial intelligence, met de kunstmatige intelligentie, heel veel dingen combineren. Ja. Is dat dan een manier om voorwaarts voor depressie?
Ik denk wel dat het kansrijk is, maar dan denk ik zelf, het zal toch altijd aanvullend zijn. Hè? Kijk, wat ik echt belangrijk zou vinden, daar gaat het onderwerp over, dat we inderdaad snel naar dat gepersonaliseerde toe kunnen stappen. Nu, als met biomarkers of data kan worden vastgesteld dat die patiënt beter af is met RTMS en die met medicatie, en dan misschien ook nog zelfs met de hoogte van de medicatie, dat zou natuurlijk fantastisch zijn. Ja. Want het is wel heel veel wachten en we maken met elkaar natuurlijk ook tussen richtlijnen en de standaarden. Stepped care, ja, dat is de werkelijkheid van de GGZ op dit moment. Als jij esketamine wil hebben, dan moet je eerst 3 failed trachers hebben. En dan mag je pas in aanmerking komen. Dat is met de psychiaters, dat is met de zorgverzekeraars afgesproken. Waarom, als we zeker weten dat die esketamine bij die patiënt direct gaat werken, waarom wachten we erop? Ja. En dat houden we met elkaar in stand, hè? Ik kijk ook naar jou als psychiater, maar de psychiaters bepalen dat ook.
Ik voel me direct aangesproken.
Nee, dat is met RTMS ook. De eerste 2 mag pas als derde stap. Ja, waarom? Kosten?
Ja, het is een goede vraag. Ook voor een deel misschien de cultuur om Nederland om eerst maar eens, als je naar de huisarts gaat, kijk het maar even aan. Ja. Ik weet niet of dat een rol speelt. Maar die biomarkers zijn er nog niet. En het feit dat we zo lang gezocht hebben, decennia zullen we maar zeggen, en het nog niet gevonden hebben, is dat iets dat de complexiteit van depressie hoog is, dat de heterogeniteit te veel is, dat we op de verkeerde plekken hebben gekeken? Of is het een kwestie van lange adem volhouden?
Ik denk het laatste, lange adem volhouden, want er zijn natuurlijk ook nu onderzoeken met EEG's die toch een bepaalde voorspellende waarde hebben. En ook als het gaat over de psychiater of uiteindelijk op grond van zo'n algoritme de voorspelling doen, dan is dat via de analyse van die EEG's toch beter. Dus je ziet dan wel dat er vooruitgang wordt geboekt. Dus ik ben daar ook wel optimistisch in. Ik zeg tegen iedereen, ga door. Ja. We hebben het gewoon keihard nodig in de praktijk.
Zijn psychiaters te bang voor neurowetenschappen?
Lang wel, ja. Psychiatrie is natuurlijk toch echt een vak apart. En zo stellen de psychiaters er ook vaak op. En vooral ook denk ik de wat oudere generatie. Maar er zit zoveel vooruitgang ook in de neurowetenschappen. Ik denk dat de psychiatrie het daar toch voor een groot gedeelte van moet gaan hebben.
Dus eigenlijk is met alle zwaarte waar we het over hadden in het begin van de depressie, is jouw boodschap ook wel, nou, toch wel een optimistische, of in ieder geval met perspectief.
Nou ja, dat woord, het moet gewoon perspectief hebben. Het is natuurlijk een ziekte van perspectiefloosheid. En als wij met elkaar zien dat dingen gaan werken, en ik zeg altijd vanuit de depressievereniging, het gaat natuurlijk vooral om die 25% mensen die in die chronische depressie zitten, die heel ernstig zijn. Daar gaat het om, want die andere, die 70%, dat gaat over. Er zijn mensen die spontaan herstel, na 3 of na 5 maanden. Dat gebeurt natuurlijk ook in de praktijk. Maar die 20%, ja, daar moeten we met z'n allen gewoon echt onze schouders onder zetten. Want 20% van 700.000 mensen die in een jaarlijkse depressie hebben, dat is natuurlijk heel veel.
Ja, en je praat dus over 5 suïcides per dag in Nederland.
Ja. En zeker.
Ja. Ik wil jou, want we zijn tegen het einde, je hebt ongelooflijk veel verteld. Ik vind het supergoed en eigenlijk geef je zelf uiting naar alles wat je hebt meegemaakt om het stigma te bestrijden. Om gewoon voor 600 man jouw verhaal te vertellen met hele persoonlijke dingen. Maar laat zien hoeveel impact depressie heeft. En tegelijkertijd laat je ook heel goed zien, ja, waar doen we het voor? Waarom bij Amsterdam Neuroscience en alle facetten doen we onderzoek naar dit soort aandoeningen in de complexiteit. En ik vond het heel fijn om zo met jou van gedachten te wisselen. Dus ik wil jou heel erg bedanken voor dit gesprek, Bart.
Dank je wel.
So, thank you so much, Bart, for sharing your story. That was, to me, very much insightful. I investigate depression, but that's so much different if you read journal articles compared to the actual story underlying that. And Bart already alluded towards what may be the future. And, well, every one of you already pointed out that the future is precision psychiatry. And one of the enablers is, to my opinion, artificial intelligence. So we have 2 speakers who give different flavors of how to utilize artificial intelligence to move towards precision psychiatry. And it's my honor to introduce you to Nikolaos Koutsouleris. He is, I have to put this all on paper because it's quite a list. He is psychiatrist and professor for neurodiagnostic applications in psychiatry at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He is group leader at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry. And in addition, he has 2 visiting professorships, one at King's College London and one at Icahn School of Medicine in New York. And he works mainly on using AI together with neuroimaging to early diagnose patients with psychosis and to predict what will happen thereafter. And this is also mainly in combination with a large EU consortium, PRONIA, which you'll probably allude upon later. His work is very well known in the field of psychiatry. He publishes most of his work in kind of the top journals in the field. In addition, you can all use, I made some advertisements here for his software package, because he has NeuroMiner, which is kind of the easy tool for everyone using MATLAB who doesn't know much about machine learning. You can more or less plug and play. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, Guido, for having me. It's not a plug-and-play tool. I have to dampen the enthusiasm, however. So you have to know a little bit about machine learning if you really want to use it. But before we start with machine learning, I would like to tell you a little bit more about how I came to that field as a clinician scientist. I'm a psychiatrist. I work with young people, as shown here. It's a bit stretched, I don't know why. Anyways, so I work in a ward for transitional youth mental health, so dealing with young people between the age of 16 and 25. And that's an age window where I think we could achieve most. We could win the game against these diseases, because this is the window of opportunity, but it's also a window of big challenges. Why? Because the conditions in that window, in that maturational age period, the conditions, they are fuzzy, they flow into each other. And very frequently I see cases coming to our ward which have a long history of diagnoses. So they start typically in the age of 12 with, for example, ADHD or autism. A few years later, they develop depression. And then they come to us and they have attenuated psychosis. And the problem is how we could leverage the nice methods that we have at our fingertips, neuroscientific methods. It's an incredible richness that we have as tools compared to the situation of neuroscience 20, 30 years ago. How can we bring the pieces together to make our predictions, our diagnoses, our treatments, as you said, nicely more precise? And Guido alluded to that. And it's, of course, a session about individuality. So using these data to come up with more individual predictions. But we have to be also aware of the pitfalls. So you have, on the one hand, group-level science, I call it. This is where we are coming from. This is what we have been doing for the last 100 years. And on the other hand, you have individuality. I would even say idiosyncrasy, potentially. And somewhere in the middle, there is a sweet spot where we have to identify regularities that can work at the individual level. And not moving off the track so that's a very, very big challenge when you use these methods. And I'll try to outline that as well. So, as I said, we have a lot of methods available to measure individual phenotypes from the behavior down to the genome. What could we do with that? First of all, and I think, Christiaan, you alluded to that, I tried to understand a little bit, and my Dutch is not that good, but I understood from the last part that you were talking about heterogeneity and how to basically decompose that heterogeneity into more precise treatments, for example, like RTMS, when to use RTMS and maybe when not to use it, or use psychotherapy and combinations maybe and so on. So we can use that richness with maybe AI and decompose that heterogeneity along different axes. As shown here paradigmatically, for example, one axis could be to measure transition risk, transition to a manifest disorder. Or another axis could be social functioning over time, and so on and so forth. So you can identify meaningful, meaning clinically meaningful, actionable axes, and project that heterogeneity onto that system. So this is actually, I would say, where we currently are in this field of precision psychiatry. But we could do much, much more, potentially. For example, we can use these spaces, these decomposed heterogeneity spaces, to rate individuals and use that to understand mechanisms better. So the field is just starting to do that. That means we can identify subgroups, for example, clusters of individuals, and find model systems that explain that these much more homogeneous groups much more adequately than the current model systems we have. And we could try to delineate mechanisms in these mechanism spaces that are linked much more closely with these decomposed spaces. I hope you understand what I mean. And then, and this is something which is really at the horizon, but it has not started yet really, we could use these models that are really well validated to test them for their clinical utility. At the moment, nobody's really doing that. So we are still living in the stage where we think, okay, we have a nice model, it works well, but is it useful? Does it change patients' lives? Is it meaningful for deciding in the individual case, whether you need treatment A or B, that's completely unknown. Let me focus on this stage where we currently are, building more precise clinical tools. And I would like to use the example of psychosis development. Psychosis, as you may know, is not a condition that just falls from the sky. It has I would say, a prodromal period. We also say a high-risk period if we take the perspective. Yeah? So we look into the future. We don't know how many people will develop psychosis. Actually, for individuals who fulfill clinical high-risk criteria, we know that approximately 20% will develop psychosis. So that's not a very useful knowledge, I would say. So what would you do with that 20%? Will you say to your patient, you have a 20% risk of developing a very severe condition? You wouldn't dare to do that, right? Because this is there is no individual prediction in this group level estimate or or prevalence estimate. So the question is, can we find a way to identify the individuals that will go on to develop the severe disorder? We know that by intervening early, we can substantially reduce the risk by about 50% for a 12-month period of developing psychosis using quite different approaches, so like psychotherapy, potentially medication, and so on. So we would need a method that sticks at that stage when we assess these individuals and augments our decision-making process. Tells us this individual has a likelihood of 80% or 90% of developing psychosis, and in this patient you have to do something, and in the other patient it's fine, you can just continue with watchful waiting. Okay, imagine we have such a model. Would you think you can use this right away? You have demonstrated that it works in your sample. Maybe you have teamed up with a colleague. In the second sample, it also seems to work. Okay, is this ready for clinical use? Most likely not, because you have to, if you're serious about bringing this to clinical care, you have to pass a tedious process of demonstrating generalizability. And this is shown in this, what I call the validation pyramid. So at the lowest level of evidence, and this is what 95% of the studies actually do in the machine learning field at the moment. At the lowest level of validity, you show within your sample generalizability. So it's not proper generalizability, I would say, but you can say the model identified a structure that works in unseen individuals at your site. If you are lucky and have multi-site data available, you can play this game of leaf site out validation. What does it mean? So you train on a couple of sites as a predictive model. You keep one side back, hold it back, and then you apply your model to this held back side. And that's a very powerful mechanism. Imagine you have a study which is international, which covers not just maybe the Netherlands and Germany and the US, but maybe also Tanzania, India, Australia, other places in the world, South America, and so on. And thus you could basically measure transportability, we call it. So how does your model fare if it's taken to a genetically completely different population, with a different cultural background, with a different socioeconomic background, and so on. And at the highest level of the pyramid, we have, in retrospective validation, you have this teaming up of projects, which had maybe their own little different inclusion-exclusion criteria. So they defined, the phenotypes that we use, unfortunately in psychiatry, they all show a variation, right? And this variation can be, of course, a big challenge, but it's maybe also an opportunity to make the phenotypes more precise that we're aiming for. So you can leverage that and do this project-out validation. If you're done with that validation pyramid, in particular with the second and the third layer, you can be sure enough that this model could work in new subjects, in new individuals, new patients. And then you enter the stage of prospective validation. You run a clinical trial. You use this method for treatment assignment. You use this model for making individual prognosis. how did it come that we are not there yet in psychiatry? How other fields have progressed. Think about the Framingham risk calculator for coronary heart disease. Why don't we have that in psychiatry? And I want to show you a little bit of mathematics just on that slide. Forgive me, but I think it's very important because there is a relationship between effect size, so an effect size that you measure in your data, and separability. For example, think about classification models. This is shown here, basically an effect size of 2. This is a very large effect size, as you can see on the table, induces a separability of a PPV of 0.6 and an NPV of 0.9 in a prevalence situation of 25%. So think about the transition scenario that I told you just about previously. Transition to psychosis, predicting transition to psychosis. What are the effect sizes that we see in psychiatry research or neuroscience research? The maximum that I found is 1.4 in spectroscopy. So we are far away from these two. And there is this kind of relationship between separability and effect size. And if you change the prevalence, you see that you need astronomical effect sizes to reach a clinically meaningful separability with classical statistics. So you'll never get there, unfortunately. Just a small example from my own scientific career. This is how I started in 2009. So we ran a study to predict psychosis onset in these young people. And we found, with voxel-based morphometry, a cluster in the brain, the prefrontal cortex, as shown here, that separated at baseline, so 4 years before the people developed psychosis, these transition cases from the non-transition cases. I was enthusiastic when I saw that, and I thought, wow, I found a biomarker. But then I extracted the signal from that cluster and plotted it. And what you can see here is, of course, there's a mean difference, and you can nicely publish with that. No worries about this. But when you use simply the confidence intervals to define a classifier, you see that this is not better than throwing a coin. Yeah, it's useless. And why is that the case? It's not just because of statistics. This is also one reason I just showed that to you. It's because of the complexity of these conditions, where biological alterations are just one part of the much more complex landscape that we don't see, but we could measure it and we could maybe use methods much more effectively to tease out structure from this complexity. And what happens is, because we have to define entities, because we have to treat these patients, what happened is that clinicians made green table decisions to assign individuals to different classes, and what happens is that patients who belong, for example, to psychosis show extremely differing phenotypes, as we saw also on the video for depression. There is basically no explanation of depression from one patient to the other that really completely 100% matches. So there is a lot of variation. Guido alluded to Pronia, a project that I had the pleasure to coordinate over the last couple of years. Pronia was an effort to basically use a multi-site setting to collect rich sets of data, to mine out the data to identify signatures with machine learning that can help us to predict psychosis development at the individual level. This is a prospective study with a nice feature that we did not only focus on these young people with attenuated psychosis, but also included young people, same age, with depression, first episode depression. And that was very relevant because we saw that depression in that age, I spoke just about that with you, they are close to each other. So there are patients with depression who actually develop attenuated psychosis over the course of these 2 years follow-up study. Okay. We used then simple machine learning tools to ask these data whether they contain information that we could leverage for individualized prediction. We did this, remember, in this setup from the behavior to the genome. We did this with clinical data, with 140 variables, and asked the algorithm to find out just the ones that are non-redundant, and there were 7 variables that predicted a future psychosis with an accuracy of about 76%. We also used polygenic risk scores for schizophrenia and found that they were also predictive after correcting for ethnicity effects. We also analyzed structural imaging data and found that there is a pattern in the brain, as you see here, particularly occupying the limbic system and the precuneus and also the prefrontal cortex, that predicts with an accuracy of about 71%. So these methods, they are not so different in terms of accuracy from each other. Maybe the genetic model was a bit weaker. As I said, external validation is extremely important because you don't know whether your model has learned, as I say, the hair on the ear. This could have happened. You don't know. There is another study published in Nature which shows that, for example, distinguishing COVID cases using X-ray, chest X-rays, can lead to severe biases because the models tend to learn tokens instead of the pathology. Yeah? So right-left tokens, for example, on the image. So you have to really test your models. And this is what we did in 2 different samples. And in both samples, Swiss samples, we found that the models generalized very similarly, produced very similar prediction performance, in around 70%. It's also important to understand what the model has learned in terms of the potential mechanisms. Of course, with structural MRI, you're far away from understanding mechanisms, but still it's a first step. An important step is to compare what the model has learned against healthy people. So is this a deviation from normality? What is that, what we have learned? And indeed, that was the case. So we found that these individuals had volume increases in the hippocampal system and volume reductions in the occipital and precuneus cortex. So what that means is a different story. We think that at least the volume increases could be an immunological process that is going on in that acute phase before the onset of the disease. Okay, when you want to bring this into the clinic, there are, however, many, many more challenges. And the first challenge is to convince your peers that this will potentially make a difference. So to do that, you have to know what the performance of clinicians is in predicting psychosis. Is your model better or worse, or how does it fare against clinical or human pattern recognition? So we asked our raters, and we were really surprised to see that it's not random. So they're not like throwing a coin. They actually are quite good in ruling out future psychosis. They're not as good as ruling it in. So they miss out the cases who develop later on psychosis, and we wondered why that is the case, and think that it's a bit of a bias. Particularly if you have young people, you tend to think that they will do better than they actually do. Yeah? That was actually independent of experience. Yeah? And in cases with depression, I have to say that this classifier was trained not just on clinical high-risk individuals, but also first episode depression cases. In patients with depression, that was even more pronounced. Yeah? So because you don't expect a depression case to develop psychosis later on. Okay, so the combined algorithm that uses all the different data performs significantly better. And the question is, do we gain something from integrating human and artificial intelligence by integrating the human component into the overall system? And indeed, and that was also a quite striking finding, so the clinician became a feature in this meta-learning space, or meta-learner, and it became the most important feature for the meta-learner. Yeah? The most important feature, followed by genetics and the clinical neurocognitive assessment or data domain. And far off, unfortunately, for me, who is a clinical neuroimaging person, the imaging data, right? Far away. Okay, but this is how it is. And that was even better. So what we call the cybernetic modeling, combining these two worlds, was even better than each of them alone. Okay, but this is something where I think, well, that's nice, okay, you do a multimodal prediction model and you want to bring it to the clinic, and then you have to go, well, to the insurance companies potentially to convince them that they have to invest and pay for that. And then they will tell you, okay, are you crazy? Imaging for each person here. This is not going to work. So you have to find a way how to combine this in a meaningful, in a health economically feasible way. And we developed a method to do that. Think about this case here, for example. This white circle sits at the boundary between these two distributions. You have maximum uncertainty for this individual. So what you're trying to do now is to combine data domains in a way that this person is shifted in either or direction. And this is a sequential optimization problem that we integrated into Neurominer. Guido alluded to that. So we have an algorithm that can be used freely, and that identifies the optimal sequence. And it identified a sequence, which is not a big surprise. It's very similar to what we all do. So we first assess a person clinically. This was the first examination, the first model in this chain. Then we make an estimate. That was the second. And then we add biological data at later stages. This is what an agnostic model who has no idea about clinical pathways identified as the most useful approach. And what happens is that you don't need to do all these examinations in everyone. You just pass the individuals which are uncertain in a window of uncertainty to the next examination. This is what we call deferral learning. So we learn to defer an individual from one node to the next in this chain. That's reduced the necessity of MRI to 40%, and you can even reduce it further. So you just need, in 40 individuals out of 100, an structural MRI scan, which is a big, I think, a game changer for biological prediction models. Okay, is this something unique to the transition problem, or do we see this as a general phenomenon? These are the statistics for the combined model, and this is another problem from Pronia, where we try to predict social functioning after a year. And you see the same effect. So adding data domains, concatenating them, improves the performance if you do it properly, and you do this in a cross-validated, nicely cross-validated manner. And the combination with the human intelligence further boosts this prediction performance. Okay, but have we then learned the same thing, the same pattern? It didn't seem to be the case. So you see on the one side, you see the transition signature. On the other side, the social functioning prediction signature, and they look very different. And that's quite interesting. They were also not correlated, the predictions of these two models. So we really learned to different dimensions in this decomposition or heterogeneity space, which are potentially also actionable in a different manner. So you would do something else for a person who has a high risk for social dysfunction after a year than in a person who has a high risk for transition. And if they have both risks, then you might do something else as well, a third approach. Okay, this is the supervised learning part. So supervised learning means, and I think that Mark will go more into that, you have a clear primary endpoint. You do everything you do to predict that endpoint. There are also other ways to tackle heterogeneity in our field. And I would like to introduce you to the comparative approach. What does comparative approach mean? So first of all, let's return back to this problem of heterogeneity on the longitudinal scale, because this is the most important part of it. It's not so much about the different symptoms. They are very relevant for the patients themselves, of course. But what is, I think, much more important is how people develop over time. This is actually also how the old psychiatrists like Kraepelin, Bleuler, and so on, who had the opportunity to follow these individuals over decades, this is how they define these conditions. And I think that we have left that, unfortunately. So it's about the time to return to that. So we see that heterogeneity, and unfortunately there are people who have very, very poor courses, despite all available treatment options. This is a study from the 80s from Gerd Huber. in 500 first episode patients with psychosis, and you see that there is about a quarter of these individuals who never recover from that condition, unfortunately. And this is also the part of the population which I think gave rise to the idea this is dementia precox. Yeah, dementia precox was not developed as a concept by Kraepelin, but by, I don't know why it doesn't work. Let me go back. By Arnold Pick. So, and there was a relationship basically between these two concepts. So the idea is that these young people who develop these devastating courses, they are relatively close to a biology which we use at the moment to describe dementia. And if you look, for example, at frontotemporal dementia, there is an interaction with the age of onset. So the younger the people are who develop frontotemporal dementia, the more likely they are misdiagnosed as patients with schizophrenia, because there are these similarities. And obviously, it's an obvious thing to try to relate that, to comparative approach, schizophrenia to frontotemporal dementia. There is evidence in the literature for that, which shows that families of carriers of a specific mutation of FTD, they have a much increased risk of schizophrenia and depression. So how do we do that? This comparative approach, how do we implement that? We learn, for example, a classifier, a model that separates healthy people from patients with frontotemporal dementia. This is basically like a filter, if you want, or a similarity assessment method. And then we apply that to another condition. Think about schizophrenia, for example, which we think is somehow related to this to the original phenotype A. So we have done that with a nice collaboration with the colleague Matthias Schröter from Leipzig. And you see basically here this classifier, this using neuroimaging data, structural imaging data. And if you just look at the pattern, you might see that it's quite similar to what you know from schizophrenia. It occupies basically the prefrontal, the medial prefrontal cortex, the insula, the hippocampus, and so on. We applied this classifier now to different conditions like AD, so Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, depression, and what we saw is that this model scored patients with schizophrenia, so 40% of the patients with schizophrenia to have frontotemporal dementia. And that was only the case in 10% of patients with depression. So schizophrenia, we can say, is closer, it's not the same, but it's closer to the construct the model has learned, the differences it has learned. And now what we did is we basically wanted to see whether that relates to these devastating courses over time. That some people in this cohort, also in Pronia, unfortunately, young people who did not recover over 2 years follow-up, whether that tells us something meaningful about these individuals. So what we did is we had an MRI scan at baseline and an MRI scan at follow-up. And we applied that FTD classifier to the baseline and the follow-up data. And you see here the differences between the people who did not recover in reddish colors, and the people who had retained recovery, or who recovered over time. First of all, at baseline, their FTD score, but also their schizophrenia score. So we did this also for schizophrenia classifier and AD classifiers and so on. Their scores were elevated. And what happened is that in a 1 year period of time, the score almost doubled. Their FTD score almost doubled in their brains. So that means that there is a progression going on, obviously. So many more were deemed to belong to FTD by this classifier at follow-up compared to baseline. Bringing back the idea that schizophrenia or these severe disorders, these were not only clinical high-risk individuals, also first episode depression cases, that there is a subpopulation, fortunately a small one, which has a progressive course over time. Okay, the last part of the talk, a few minutes left, is to understand heterogeneity better. I call it is the subtyping approach or clustering approach. And I want to show you how we implemented that in the Pronia sample. So we had the supervised approach, we had the comparative approach, and now we use the data itself to inform us about structure in the data, and I think Mark might also allude to that in his talk. So what did we do? We took in all the individuals, healthy people, clinical high-risk individuals, first episode depression cases, first episode psychosis cases, which we also recruited into the study. We put them all in one bucket and ran basically a clustering algorithm on the clinical data of these individuals, and we found 4 replicable disease dimensions or phenotype dimensions. And we called them positive symptoms, negative symptoms, depression, and functioning. And this, by assigning those, basically you can, those individuals to those dimensions, you can investigate the properties of these dimensions better. So here, for example, in the positive symptoms, distress and basic symptoms cluster, we had particularly first episode patients with psychosis and clinical high-risk individuals. They had lower premorbid functioning, they had higher scores of polygenic risk for schizophrenia, and they had overall much more positive symptoms, obviously. And here in the negative symptoms cluster, we had a mixed sample. You see it's transdiagnostic now, so it's not considering the DSM boundaries or the clinical definitions that we have used. It just identifies commonalities in the data. And here we found a transdiagnostic cluster which loads on these negative symptoms, basically, and also has a high risk for schizophrenia at the genetic level. I'll skip over the other ones. And now I want to show you the catch of all this, because there is a problem. You cannot expect that when you do clustering, that you might find these clusters across all these data domains. We thought so, that we would find these 4 clusters also in the brain imaging data, but that was not the case. We just found 2 clusters at the brain data. One cluster, one group of individuals which had distributed brain volume reductions in the gray matter and white matter, and another group which was spared from that, which also included a lot of patients, actually, not just healthy people, but patients. And we saw basically that relating these 2 domains to each other, so the 4 subgroups at the clinical layer and the 2 subgroups at the brain imaging layer, that clarified a bit the picture, and showing basically that the 3 clusters, which at the clinical level were associated with, let's say, a rather poor outcome, they loaded on this reduced volume subgroup. So it's like a transdiagnostic vulnerability pattern, if you want, that we found at the brain level. Okay, I skip over that for the sake of time and would like to conclude. So what are the next steps? I think it's important to assess and compare data domains for their predictive value, for the diagnostic, prognostic, and what we call theranostic, so treatment predictive value. I think it's extremely important to test the generalizability of these models as thoroughly as possible across different patient populations. I think we have now the increasing opportunity to do that, also in registry samples, in epidemiologically valid samples. Models that have been trained on clinical samples should be applied to population-based samples and vice versa to better understand how these models act in different contexts also, because that's key for translation. And I think then it's important to identify which areas of our healthcare system really would benefit from what I call algorithmic augmentation, and where we are not there yet, or where we shouldn't do it, where we shouldn't use predictive models maybe. And then test these models prospectively, as I showed in the beginning, because they are the big unknowns. And the last point, which I think is also extremely important, and it becomes mandatory in the future if you think about EU regulations. So if you're serious about your model and you want to bring it to your patients and you may want to monetize it, I don't know, you have to make sure that it informs clinical decision-making and patients' understanding of what's going on. So imagine you're a patient and your clinician tells you, okay, you have a 90% risk of developing multiple sclerosis in the next 5 years. You may want to know why that is the case. And if you're a clinician, you may want to know why that is the case because you want to choose the right treatment. So the models have to be transparent. And I think that will also be a part of Mark's presentation to talk more about model transparency and interpretability. And with that, I would like to close, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Nikos, for a great talk and a great overview about the opportunity for AI. We're running a bit late, but nevertheless, we have some time for a couple of questions. And I already see a couple on the monitor here. If there are anyone else in the room, I think there's also microphones. Otherwise, we just start here. How can you use resilience factors in the algorithms? For instance, through a cohort at high risk of developing psychosis that do not develop complaints.
Absolutely. So, but then you need to change the endpoint. So you need to understand, for example, why people do not develop that outcome. And that means using different frameworks or analytical setups to those that I just showed, where you look into basically recovery versus non-recovery, and then compare the signatures that you found to the signatures that you found when you predicted transition versus non-transition, for example. And the differential image might tell you what resilience factors might exist. Yeah.
Then, and as you in the audience, should in these early days precision psychiatry focus on more severe cases? If so, should severity measures be more developed and accepted in clinical triage?
That's a good question. I think by focusing more on severe cases, you might lose the window of opportunity that I showed initially. So I think where it's most to gain is really in this transitional period from childhood to adulthood. And usually in that stage, the patients are not that sick yet, and you have much higher levels of brain plasticity. So when we think about severe cases, you have also severe cases, unfortunately, there, but the prevalence for severity, let's say, and crystallized pathology is higher at higher ages, and this is more difficult to modify. So I wouldn't say that we should focus on severe cases, but rather on early cases. And identify as early as possible.
And would you say that there may be two ends of this spectrum, that either early on to prevent worse from happening?
And identify then maybe in patients with these crystallized pathologies, capacity to recover or resilience potentials that could be activated, basically, to improve symptoms and outcomes. Yeah. Yeah.
There was also a nice one about implementation. Maybe you skip that one and we'll keep that for the follow-up at the end. Do you think building more complex and deep AI models give sufficient data will lead to better prediction models? So more data,
that's a big
complex
question.
Models?
More and more data won't solve the problem. You see, if you just add data, usually the prediction performance goes down because you just add heterogeneity. So what you need to do is to devise smart ways to decompose heterogeneity. And this is, I try to convey that actually you need to tackle that instead of just sticking with the old case control paradigms and collecting data for those. So it's rather important to represent the complexity with large amounts of data and then use these kind of approaches to tear apart the noise or separate the noise from structure in these large cohorts. If deep learning is better than shallow learning, I'm undecided. I think that sometimes it might be better to stick with the easier model, following Occam's razor. You know, the William of Ockham, who said that if you have models that perform similarly well, choose the easiest one. I think this is really a nice sort of principle that we should follow, because these models are usually much more interpretable than complex deep learning models where it's an abyss. You don't know what actually they have learned. But, yeah.
And then along the lines what you showed with adding different forms of information, could you then also consider like, okay, if we start with an easy model and if that can be outperformed elsewhere?
Yeah, and that combines also with deploying different complexity models to different places in the healthcare system. So a clinician in his private surgery does not need a very complex model, but one that just needs 4 or 5 features, which can be assessed in 5 minutes, or a simple blood biomarker potentially. Yeah? And the more complex models maybe should be restricted to rather tertiary care units, yeah, or where they are more under control, let's say. Yeah? And there's quality control measures in place to make sure that they predict the right thing, right? And not something, because the patient is out of scope, that just arrived there and does not fulfill the criteria that this model should be applied to this person.
Thank you so much. And when I ask Christiaan to come over, thanks a lot, Nikos, for a great talk.
Thank you.
Was it okay? Too long.
Last. Thank you. For the last talk of this afternoon. So after this great talk of Nikos, we're going to Mark Hoogendoorn. I'm very happy that you're here, full professor of artificial intelligence at Free University and head of the quantitative data analytics group. Collaborations a lot with psychiatry, not only fundamental machine learning, but also applied machine learning in e-health and m-health. Also, you wrote a book on the quantified self, and also volleyball player, very diverse person. So, and also one of the consortium members of the Stress in Action gravitation grant that has been recently awarded with Brendan Bennings and Eco de Geus as leaders, among others. So I'm very happy that you're here to talk to us more about the AI and its applications. So a warm applause for Mark, please.
Thanks, Christiaan. All right, thanks a lot. Now that I stand up, I guess you understand why I chose volleyball as a sport. So it's pretty convenient to be tall when you play volleyball. Okay, yeah, so I want to share an AI perspective towards precision psychiatry. So I'm by no means a clinical expert, work mainly on AI methods and try to improve those AI methods for the domain of health. And also inspired by the kind of stories that we heard in the beginning, to try and really use AI for the benefit of patients. So I guess this is what you already know. So a brief overview of the talk. So I want to start with a very brief introduction of machine learning in psychiatry. Of course, I only have limited time, so I cannot go into great depth on techniques. I will explain a few of them on a, let's say, a high level. After that, I will show a project that we've been working on, which is in the domain of mental health, which is called eCompared. So we've been working on this project since about 2010, and this is about sort of the integration of AI in mental health care. I'll show some example applications where we applied AI within this specific project, also to show how we can make these kind of treatments more individualized, and I'll end with a discussion. Okay, so of course, Nikos has already touched upon many things around AI, so I wanted to at least have a very brief intro of this. So machine learning, that is mainly what we focus on in terms of research, and this is a discipline within AI, realizing that AI is bigger than just machine learning, which is about automatically extracting patterns from data. And I think there's quite a lot of impressive applications that are not necessarily benefiting society per se, but for example, recognizing pictures better than humans and beating the world champion in Go. Now, I don't think that will change the entire continuum where we live in, but at least you see that there are really impressive applications that are known to be highly complex. So it shows that AI can handle very complex problems. Now, why did it become so popular? Well, we have lots of data, and of course, neuroscience, and where we're sitting here today, there's no exception to that. There's more computational power. and there are better techniques available. So Nikos already explained some of, at least mentioned some of the applications of techniques. So you see that there's a lot of developments. There were some questions on, is deep learning better or not? So there is a continuous, let's say, ongoing development of these kind of techniques. When we look at the health domain, of course, we check all those boxes, right? So we have more data, we have that computational power, we have the better techniques, but we don't really see it happening in practice yet. And that's also what Nikos was referring to. So it's important to realize that while we see some of these applications that are outside of the health domain, and also in certain domains, we see in finance, or there are many domains where it's really used in practice, but in healthcare it's still fairly limited, while the impact can, of course, be very big. So what is also important to realize is that within the area of, let's say, machine learning, we distinguish different types of data. And Nikos has talked about all these types of data that I'm showing here, but I will focus on one specific, let's say, category of data in which we try to apply the work, which is unstructured data, as we call it. And I think there's sometimes a bit of confusion about this term among different disciplines, but what we mean with structured data is that it's not an image like an MRI or whatever you might have, or text, but it's really coded data, you could say. Yeah? So it's categorical measurements, numerical measurements that you do. For example, ecological momentary assessment. How is someone doing, rated on a scale, or medication, a PHQ-9, which indicates how a person is feeling, etc. Thereby, I'm not saying that the unstructured data doesn't have any value, but it's just the first thing that we focus on, because it's relatively, well, not easy, of course, hard task, but it's easier to use this type of data, and perhaps also easier to obtain, right? So we just heard that you could do this in different phases, and obtaining the kind of data that you see here, like on a questionnaire or something, is probably relatively straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the structured data. Now, if we think about treatments within the mental health domain, so what we've tried to do in a paper that we wrote is try to see what different phases or stages do you actually have in these treatments. And what kind of data do they deliver? And also what kind of decisions could you use AI to support in the treatment during each one of these phases, or maybe across phases. Now you start with sort of the pre-intervention phase, and once again this is the perspective of an AI person, not a clinician. So you start with the pre-intervention phase, where you might have some intake questionnaires, you might know some demographics of a person, you might know some personality traits. I mean, you can think of anything that you could be interested in before you, let's say, have an intervention. And hereby, decisions that you could take are, for instance, what is the best treatment for this person? Right? Based on the information I have available before I go into a treatment with someone, what is the best treatment given that information? Or, for example, what kind of extra information might I want to provide in order to make that selection, or in order to make the selection, or make the patient make the selection. Now, when we go to the intervention stage, nowadays you have interventions available that can measure quite some things around the patient. So I will show one example on the next slide. And here you might have the intervention data available, right? So depending on the setting, of course, you have more or less data. It might be that you ask a patient, could you please maintain or keep a diary to see how you are doing over the days, right? And also, what kind of activity is someone doing, for instance? So there can be all kinds of things. Some of these can be automated. Some of these things might need to be done by the patient manually. And here, in the intervention, there's actually quite some decisions you can do. Right? You can take, like, what sort of level of guidance does a patient need? Right? So, for example, does a therapist need to meet on a weekly basis, or could it be more sort of, let's say, self-help therapy? Right? So there can be all kinds of decisions within the treatment that you take. And then finally, we have the post-intervention stage, where you know the outcome. We've gone through the intervention. What is the outcome? Perhaps the patient is still using some kind of part of the treatment. And here, there might still be a need for additional interventions because it might show that there is a potential for relapse, etc. So these three, let's say, parts of the intervention also allow you to build different kinds of models that support patients, clinicians, or perhaps even automated systems. So one thing that you could study, for instance, is based on this intake data, can we somehow predict the outcome? Right? And this will allow us to, if we know the outcome with a certain treatment and with an alternative treatment, at least the prediction of that on an individual level, we are able to decide which treatment might be best for this specific patient. What we can also do is actually take this intake data, right? I call it demographics here, and within the treatment, try to see how things are evolving and also making predictions on a very fine-grained level. So how is the patient developing, and does that require perhaps an adjustment of the intervention while we're going? We can also, and that's the third type of model, say, okay, we take that same amount of data and we look at, while the patient is progressing in the intervention, do we actually know more about the outcome now? Because we're getting more and more information available that might allow us to make predictions that could be useful in perhaps steering into a certain direction. And finally, perhaps you also want to look at risk of relapse based on, well, the entire continuum of data that I'm showing here. Okay, so let's try to focus on an intervention to make this a bit more concrete and show some examples of what we've worked on. So we worked on the project called eCompared. This was together with clinical psychology within the VU, but it was a big European project. So there were many partners involved, including different sites across different countries. So this allows for a nice way of evaluating how would models that we built actually function over countries. We started with developing this app in the ICT for Depression project, which was also a European project that I think we started in 2010. So that was led by the technical people, and then after that, this was evaluated in the eCompared project. Now, what is this app? So essentially, the app supports patients while they're undergoing an intervention. And you can see here what kind of things we measure in this app. So you can see here that we provide the possibility of doing ecological momentary assessment, which is essentially answering questions on how are you doing today, what is your mood, how did you sleep, did you have a lot of social interactions. Of course, we try to avoid sending a whole battery of questions each and every day, but sometimes the patient rates, for example, mood, etc. We also know a little bit of information on, let's say, the behavior of the particular patient. So we have some questionnaires at the beginning. We also can see a little bit about system usage. So is a patient active in the app or not using the app at all? And also, for instance, location. So we don't store some kind of GPS location. Of course, you don't want to be some kind of a big brother that's watching with the patient, but we do store, is a patient often in a social location, in a sports location, because this might say something about how the patient is progressing. And next to that, there are therapeutic modules. So this includes cognitive behavior therapy, activity scheduling. So there's a variety of these modules in there that patients can choose from, also in discussion with their therapist. Now, this setting of this app was in a blended setting. So here there was a therapist active with a limited number of sessions together with the app trying to support the patient, and this was focused on depression, as ICT for Depression says, of course. Furthermore, we compared this to treatment as usual. So we had two arms in the eCompared project. One was where they would use this blended treatment, the other one where they would use treatment as usual. Okay, so we started collecting data, right? So we have around 1,000 patients in different countries. So it's the Netherlands, it's Germany, it's Switzerland, it's Poland, Sweden, Spain, and I think that's it. So there's many countries there, at least a variety of countries. And we started collecting, of course, the patients got into the trial, and a lot of data in the end resulted. So in this case, how were the patients assigned? They were assigned at random, right? So they would either get treatment as usual or they would get the blended treatment. Now, the question that we first posed ourselves is, can we actually predict whether a therapy will be successful for a certain patient? Because we obviously only know one of the two paths, right? So a patient has either been assigned the treatment as usual or has been assigned the blended treatment. So what we try to do, and this is the model type 1 that I was referring to, I hope you still know what it is, or at least what we're trying to do is using demographics to predict the outcome. So we built a model for patients in one condition, right? So we build a model saying, okay, so what if we were, based on your demographics, to assign you to the treatment as usual, what would be the probability that you would actually recover after getting this treatment? And the same for the alternative one. And then, of course, if you know sort of the prediction for both, you could select the one where you feel has the maximum probability of actually working for the patient. So these were the things that we took into account, right? So these are, let's say, the inputs for our machine learning model. And what we see, and I don't want to go into great detail on this, is that, well, actually, we get up to an area under the curve, as you can see here, of 0.76. So I think based on this intake data, this is quite reasonable, relatively simple data. What you also see, and we saw some interesting features that popped up, I think, in the previous presentation. So here we first built a model for, let's say, all of the countries, and we did leave out patients, of course, to make predictions on unseen patients. But apparently the most predictive one is whether you are actually from Poland or not. So that is the most predictive value here. It probably has to do with the system there and what treatment as usual looks like. But of course, this wouldn't generalize to other countries, evidently. So this is something where, or at least in a different setting. So this is something we also looked into. I didn't show the results here, but you can show that actually this performance also works across different countries. Okay, so this is one example where you try to create these predictions for the treatment purely based on the intake data. So that's one form of making an intervention more personalized, by just saying, go into that type of intervention, and that will hopefully maximize your probability of success. What is also interesting is within this treatment, or at least I find it interesting, is within this treatment, can you also personalize things more there? And this is a bit more of a challenging endeavor, I would say, when it comes to the AI side. So what we try to do is try to personalize this app, which is now called Moodbuster. And here we aim to maximize user engagement. So what we see in these apps is often that people use them for a few days or maybe weeks, and then they tend to lose interest, perhaps because they are feeling better again, so there's no need, or perhaps because they were, perhaps no longer interested in the types of treatments offered. And what we try to strive for is seeing, can we sort of trigger patients to be more engaged in the treatment in case they need to be. And for this, we looked at messages that are being sent in these apps. So you often have motivational messages to keep you engaged in these kind of treatments. And we distinguish different types of messages. You can have more informing messages, more encouraging or affirming. And our idea was, well, what if we can try to see whether it helps to figure out when you should send what types of messages? And for this, we use reinforcement learning. So this is a bit more of a complex type of machine learning algorithm. So I wanted to give you a crash course. 4 minutes left, so it's going to be a really crash course. So essentially what this is you're trying to optimize the sending of messages with having some kind of long-term goal in mind. Yeah? So rather than saying, I want to send a message and the patient should immediately become active in this app, you're trying to create, let's say, a whole sequence of messages that would sort of keep the patient active in the treatment. So the goal is more longer term. You want to have longer term engagement of this patient. And reinforcement learning allows you to select these kind of messages, or actions as they're called, to maximize some more long-term goal. So this is, of course, trickier than just saying, I know exactly what the feedback is right at that very moment. And therefore, this is also a more difficult learning task for these AI algorithms. Now here there's a lot of success, and I don't know if you can call the last one, personalized recommendations of Facebook, the best success ever when it comes to reinforcement learning. I guess there's some debate on that. But at least you see that these kind of algorithms, they can work very well in specific settings to keep people engaged. And hopefully, in the psychological treatments, this is better than people getting hooked to social media platforms. But this is at least what we look at. So what is important in reinforcement learning is that you have some kind of a loop, right? So we have the agent being our app. The agent decides on sending messages, which we call actions here. Then we observe the state of the patient, and based on that state of the patient, we actually decide on this would be a good message now, or that would be a good message. And in the end, we see how engaged the patient stays, and you try to select these messages to keep on having the patient engaged in this. So that was a really crash course. I hope you at least understand a little bit of reinforcement learning, at least what the principle is. So we try to do this, and this is a very texty slide, so please don't read all the stuff on there. What we decided on is what kind of information would we need of a patient in order to decide on which messages we should send when. And here what we mainly take into account is how active is a patient in the treatment, what kind of ratings did the patient provide, is the patient doing well or not, etc. And that will trigger our system to decide on a message that you would want to send. And once again, the messages we decide on are informing, encouraging, affirming, or saying, okay, maybe it's not the right moment now to send a message, so let's not send a message at all. And hereby the reward, I mentioned that we're striving for this long-term reward, is the number of ratings and the fraction of messages read. So this means essentially, do people stay engaged in this kind of application? Yeah, because, of course, the more ratings you give, also the more active you apparently are, as well as if you read messages. All right, so I'm nearing the end. So what I want to show, and unfortunately I can't show the results yet with actually depressed patients, so that the results are nearly there, but not yet. So we did research with healthy, not health subjects, but healthy subjects, sorry for the typo. So what we did is we first of all asked people to use the app. We trained the algorithm for a week, so we have some experiences with the patients, and then try to see like what kind of messages should we be sending in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. And what you see here, so left here is morning. Well, you see, well, I guess you can read it. In the middle we have the afternoon, and we have the evening. Now you see that the algorithm learns that informing at the end of the day is a good idea, but not for everyone, right? So there is some variability in there. And in the morning, you might want to send a bit more encouraging messages, right? So if you wake up, you get some encouragement, apparently that allows people more to become active in the app, etc. So we think that this is, and also the clinical psychologists involved, this seems to make sense. And of course, it depends on the person itself, whether you want to do it in that way or not. But the majority is getting sort of this kind of trade-off. All right. So I see 0 here on my monitor, so that means that I'm going to the conclusions. So one thing I did want to show, and I mean, it just shows that people do stay engaged in the app, even though they're healthy subjects. So this is by itself, I think, a good sign. But once again, doing this with actually depressed patients will show whether these results generalize to that population as well. Okay, so the conclusion. Well, I hope that I convinced you, and of course Nikos was there before me, so hopefully that makes the story even more convincing, that machine learning can contribute to personalized care in psychiatry, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. It can be used for a large variety of purposes. I've tried to show, we've seen other purposes in previous presentations, and I think what is really important is that there is this kind of collaboration between people that know a lot about the algorithms, but also people that know a lot about the application, about the patients, including, of course, the patients themselves, to really engage everyone in trying to build an AI system that actually helps everyone involved in the process. And, well, this is, of course, since I'm making innovation in AI, I had to put this on the slide, but also realize that AI, I mean, is still an ongoing field, a developing field, so I think still these kind of innovations are needed to make it suitable for the health domain, like the insights that we heard before. If you have a deep neural network, difficult, right? So there's a lot of things that can still be improved in order to make this work better. And that's it. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Mark, for this presentation.
Sure.
Did I read it right that one person in the afternoon prefer to have no messages at all?
I saw that as well. I think it was some kind of glitch in the system somehow.
Yeah, all right.
Because I think no messages were sent at all to no one. So yeah.
There are some questions. One question to start off right off the bat. You showed some beautiful clinical data and categorical data, and before that you were talking to a neuroscience community. How do you see neuroscience coming into what you've been doing and what you've been developing?
I think that's a really good question. So I actually think, and I think this is also what Nikos showed in the presentation, that I think bringing the different domains together allows you to collect. What I'm showing here with the data, the structured data, is I think not the holy grail, right? So we get up to a certain level of precision or accuracy, but I think including more information for patients for which you might still be undecided, I think can be very valuable. And I think also, sort of having insights into how the brain functions can help you also to personalize treatments better. So I think there's a lot more information that can come into play, and I think this will help also in taking it to the next level. So in that sense, I think these insights can be very valuable.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a question on humans might misdiagnose psychic disorder. When training a model, there's the risk of bringing the bias in. How can we get rid of it in supervised learning?
Well, that's a very good question, Simone. So inherently there are a lot of biases in the data that we collect, right? So, and I think many problems have been shown with this kind of bias in data. So I think what is important is to do sort of an analysis up front, like are there certain biases that could potentially influence the model? And of course, for some things, like I think the example here, it might be pretty tricky to understand whether there was a misdiagnosis. But I think being aware of the bias and also being aware that the model essentially does nothing more than pick up the bias in the data, right? If there's a bias in the data, then inevitably the AI will also somehow pick this up. So compensating for that, there are a lot of techniques for doing so, I think is very important. So, but if there is a mistake in the diagnosis in the data, of course there needs to be maybe a certainty factor associated with or something. So I think there's lots of solutions, but you are absolutely right, biases are an important thing to be aware of.
And last question, and then we get to the general discussion, is it alludes to the last question about engagement effectiveness of apps in different age groups, but also a publication in JAMA Psychiatry, I think it was, showing that there were 200, 300 apps, of which 1 or 2 or 3 or Headspace and Mindstrong are used, and the rest, there are many hundreds of apps.
Yeah.
So how do you solve that problem, also based on age and getting people engaged to use the app?
It is a huge problem. Of course, I'm not the one developing these kind of apps, but just on the AI system in the background. But what I do see is that there's such a huge landscape, and also, let's say, the overlap in the kind of data that people are sort of collecting. There is some overlap, but people are building their own app and are not really building on top of each other. So I think that is, for the field to move forward, that is not the best way to go, I would say. So what we're also trying to work on is some initiatives on, for example, trying to share data better between apps, right? So that would allow you perhaps to build richer models for, let's say, specific populations. And also to have some standards there, because, and this is probably very difficult within this domain, but at least to have some maybe common ground on things you should certainly measure in order to also be able to exchange data. So I think that is an important way forward, because if you have only a specific set of patients, you cannot generalize beyond that set if you're using AI.
Yeah. Perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm applause for Mark.
Thank you. Yeah.
And we still, Guido, I'm looking at you. How many time have we left? 10 minutes. Excellent. Sufficient time for in-depth discussion with Bart, Nikos, and Mark. So I would all like you to come up front. And I think I have a question, but I'm sure that Guido has a better question than I have. So, but also the Slido is still open. So there's a general discussion, and it's about precision psychiatry. So it's also open for any questions that you may have. So the current questions, they're very good. Thank you, Niels, and to anonymous questioners, but those can be saved for the drinks. We now go to the general discussion. Guido, can I ask you to to
I'd
open?
like to pick up on one of the questions from the audience initially. Let's say you guys have developed the best model ever. What are other barriers actually to get that to the clinic? One can think of maybe, on the one hand, clinicians that may be reluctant, maybe patients. So feel free to answer in Dutch if you prefer. And regulatory bodies. So what are we facing actually to bring this into a clinical practice?
Yeah,
everybody's looking at Mark.
No, I'm happy to start kicking off, and then feel free to jump in. So I think what we actually see is that this is a big problem. So maybe that's good to first identify. I was talking to Nikos before the presentation, and there is some research on what sort of, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but technologically readiness level are we at? And you see that people are building a lot of models, but that's where it stays, right? So it's not really being evaluated into alternative, let's say, cohorts, but also not really landing in practice. The question, of course, is why do we end up in not resulting in any useful models in practice? I think there are quite big jumps if you really want to apply it in practice, and there are regulations around it, right? So I think first properly validating the model, and I think this is also what Nikos is, maybe you can add later on if you want to add more to that, but I think evaluating it in different cohorts, making sure it generalizes well, I think is very important before you can really use it in a good practical setting. But next to that, if you have that, then getting CE marking, there are all kinds of regulations around it, and that's a much bigger sort of jump that you need to make. And you're right, also the clinicians, so I think I mainly talk to clinicians that are enthusiastic about using this in practice, because they often approach us to do something with AI. But I can imagine that it's also a bit scary, and I can imagine for patients it's the same. There is this AI system, whatever it might be, and it's not always insightful. So I think going for simple, insightful models, talking to clinicians and patients more to make sure they're the right systems that really support them, and seeing it not as a replacement, but as a support system, I think can help bring it into practice. And
Nikos, you are a clinician yourself, so what would for you be the criterion that you'd say, yes, I would use this for treatment recommendations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would be confident in using a model for a very limited scope initially. So I like to compare this with autonomous driving. You see how, although billions of dollars and euros have been spent into developing autonomous cars, we're still not there yet, and they create all sorts of accidents because this is wildlife. That means it's really uncontrolled, and anything can happen on the street. So, and if you compare this to a healthcare context, I think we are very, very far away from an AI companion tool like an AI clinician, who makes decisions by himself. So I see this rather as an additional tool for a very clear and circumscribed question. And for that, you have to go, as Mark said, through this whole regulatory process, which is also very expensive and time-consuming. But I see that there is a way forward for that, so it shouldn't be too far away. And I would be confident as a clinician. If the model generalizes well, if it has demonstrated clinical utility, then I would be happy using that.
En Bart, hoe kijk jij daar tegenaan? Dat op het moment dat er is iets en er komt vervolgens, je gaat dan naar de arts en die zegt tegen jou, ja, de computer zegt dat ik A, B of C moet doen. Hoe zie jij dat?
Nou, ik denk dat waar we het natuurlijk over hebben is over implementatie. Dat is een van de allergrootste problemen volgens mij in de zorg. Hè. Er is innovatie, er is een nieuwe behandelmethode, een nieuwe medicatie. En hoe krijg je dat uiteindelijk daar in die spreekkamer tussen die huisarts, psychotherapeut of psychiater? Dat is lastig. Dus ik zou in ieder geval zeggen, denk altijd en in een heel vroeg stadium na over die implementatie. Hoe ga je dat doen? Er zijn natuurlijk heel veel strategieën denkbaar. Ik denk als patiënt dat op het moment dat zo'n model vanuit, zal maar zeggen, wordt gepresenteerd, ook uitgelegd. Ik denk dus dat die psycho-educatie, waar zijn we nu mee bezig, wat kan het jou helpen, dat in ieder geval een belangrijke voorwaarde is. Maar het zal stapsgewijs gaan en op kleine schaal. Want ja, de grote schaal vindt toch als je gaat praten in ieder geval over depressie, dat zijn natuurlijk alle huisartsen in Nederland, dat is de GGZ, dat zijn de klinieken. En het gaat natuurlijk over een hele grote groep mensen die het betreft.
En zie jij daar gewoon, want het is natuurlijk wel iets anders dat je vertelde ook in je verhaal, jij gaat naar jouw huisarts, die ken je al, daar heb je een band mee opgebouwd. Nu krijgt die huisarts dan zijn informatie, ja, er staat op mijn scherm, we gaan dit doen. Voel jij je daar prettig bij? Zie je daar belemmeringen om dat te volgen? Of is het juist, ja, nu is er meer bewijs voor dat we dat inderdaad dat we dat pad moeten wandelen?
Nou ja, als het uitgelegd wordt, is er geen probleem. Kijk, nu werken huisartsen en psychotherapeuten, psychiaters natuurlijk volgens richtlijnen en standaarden. En die hebben ze soms ook op het scherm staan en dan leggen ze uit waarom die keuze nu wordt gemaakt of er wordt aan ons patiënten een keuze voorgelegd. Dat zou nog beter zijn. Dus als het op die manier gebeurt, denk ik dat veel mensen daar geen bezwaar tegen zullen hebben. Als het maar de grootste kans geeft op een succesvolle behandeling.
Ja, dus succes. Then I'll get back to both of you. Like, how good is good enough? So Bart would be fine if the system would give a good recommendation. But what do you qualify as being good?
This one is for you.
That's the hard one, yes. You cannot answer that in general, so it depends on what we call the pretest probability of a problem. So if you know that a condition leads, for example, to think about mild cognitive impairment, where you have transition rates to Alzheimer's disease which are way higher than transition to psychosis from attenuated psychosis. So there you need to have a very, very good model to make a difference. And so it depends really on the pre-existing likelihoods of a certain endpoint, let's say.
But it's also like the questions from Hilgo, that's a great question, and Milou, and other people also teaming up on that. So if you are dealing with the DSM, which is of course a quite coarse grid on psychiatric reality, but also existing treatments that we are already having there, are we collecting the right data? Is the AI not keeping the old patterns in shape? And is it good for innovation, new biological categories? How do you see that?
Yeah. Shall I?
Yeah, shall I go ahead? Yeah.
I think it's worthwhile starting with what we have, because at the moment we treat all these treatments as a one-size-fits-all approach or trial and error, and it would be already a massive difference if we would be able to target the right person with the right treatment. And if we reach a certain ceiling, then of course it would be worthwhile to start with the next generation of treatments. And during that process of clearing up the mess of heterogeneity, you might find signatures which incite further research, sort of, for the new treatments. But my first short-term goal would be to know, okay, I know I have to use citalopram with patient X and venlafaxine with patient Y, for example. I would be happy with that.
Yeah.
And I'm considering time, maybe one last question from the audience is, should we start teaching how AI works? Should that be part, basically the toolbox for new doctors?
So maybe I start with this one.
I think you say no, right? You're asking
only AI specialists
innovation
know,
guy whether. Well, okay, see what
it's a secret ingredient that I will never tell to anyone. No. Certainly, I would say. Yeah. So I think it is very important to be aware of, let's say, what benefits AI can bring, but certainly also what the risks are. Because I think there also tends to be sometimes an over-optimism of AI, which is, of course, also not a good thing. So I think teaching, of course, they don't all have to become AI experts, but still understanding enough of it to understand the possibilities and the no-goes, I think will be crucial. Also, so we've done some of these lectures, and I think you're giving lectures very soon to medical specialists. So I think after you explain them, they also understand it better, but I think they're also not completely aware how it might change their way of working. So knowing all of this can be very useful, and I think also a good way forward to use AI in the right settings, I would say.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you all for your great contributions. Thank you, Bart, for your telling your story here. I hope you all enjoyed it. I think we're off to the next You will continue there?
Yes.
So thanks to speakers.
Okay. Thank you very much.